The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hi there, and welcome to the People's View for Thursday, November 21st, 2019. My name is Bill Ohm. I'm your host tonight. With me are my friends Barbara Griffin, former Speaker Pro Tem and current House member, and Kevin Avard, former House member, and now running for State Senate, coming up in another year.
Yes.
But coming up this past week was an interesting election. We had our city elections, and as I'm going through the results, which are not good for the Republicans, I came across some interesting commentary from the Hanover Town Clerk, as reported in Sunday's Union Leader. And the clerk was telling their folks in the district, the students in particular, saying that no one can be denied the right to register to vote for failing to meet the requirements of the motor vehicle codes. And that is true. You can register, you can vote, and not have current compliance with the motor vehicle code. Mm-hmm. However, what was not said is that the clock is starting, because now that you've voted, you become legally, for motor vehicle purposes, a resident of New Hampshire, and now you're obligated to register your car, get your driver's license. Did I say that correct, Barbara, or is there anything I missed?
Yeah, I think that was a great explanation, and that's the case in most states. That voting is a sign that you have declared that place to be your residence. And therefore, then you're subject to all the laws of that state, just like everybody else who's a resident. So this is coming about because of a change that was made last session in one of the laws in regards to a definition. It's a piece of it was a change in that it omitted something about thinking about whether you were going to be somewhere for the indefinite future. The indefinite future is sort of one of those phrases that can apply to everything and to nothing. And it's actually been involved in some litigation with some other cases. So what happened is in the motor vehicle laws in the definition, we're tightening that up so it's the same as everything else. So clearly, if you're voting in the state of New Hampshire, the law presumes, and your neighbor would presume, that you're now a resident of the state and should comply with the laws just like everyone else.
So what would the consequences be then for someone in Hanover who took this advice from the town clerk, voted, and didn't realize that they have to have their motor vehicles registered in New Hampshire, and they don't do that? What's the recourse? What's going to happen?
Well, I think it would be the same thing as anybody else who moves to the state and doesn't comply with the laws. You purchase a house, move here for a job. I moved to the state for a job. You're expected to comply with get a new license and re-register your car in the state.
Now, is that after 60 days or is that after 6 months?
60 days, but the reality is we know most people wait until their registration expires, and that's when they show up in your city clerk's office to finally do what they were supposed to do.
So technically, if an insurance company wanted to deny a claim to somebody who got in an accident, who voted in New Hampshire, resident was in Massachusetts, and they didn't register the vehicle in New Hampshire, nor did they change their license, could the insurance company technically deny them because they don't have a lawfully registered vehicle after a certain period of time?
Well, I'm not insurance counsel, so I don't make that representation, but I know when I do my auto insurance policy, I have to say where the car is garaged. And I think that's the trigger. We all know people who might have a summer house up here, but the car is principally garaged somewhere else, and that's where it's registered. Same thing for a license. So I think from an insurance standpoint, that's triggered more. That's more involved with the registration of the vehicle because your insurance rate is based on where the car is principally. So I do think there might be an insurance issue. I know that voting here and your registration and your license certainly affects states where you came from. You can't just go back and pick it up again. So sure, it has lots of implications.
I think people should know that. I know that in Nashua, the Republicans didn't win, obviously, and I'm very encouraged, though, to be honest with you, because even though we didn't win, there were small margins. 60 votes, 90 votes, another 69 votes. That's a very small margin. And in a midterm election, a lot of people came out and voted. And of course, there was, there was some potential electioneering going on school properties, which I think one of the school board members has been bringing up. And I think that's an issue that will be addressed and we'll follow up with. Using school property to electioneer, that's public property. I don't think that's legal. No.
So what's electioneering?
I believe that's using public school or public property to basically solicit votes.
Right. So electioneering is sort of the act of going out there and trying to campaign and elect, and there's restrictions on it, right?
Using public funds, using public employees, using public, basically money. If they're on the clock and they're using the taxpayer money to get votes, that's not right.
So there's some question as to whether or not they were using school district assets to
Fax
promote
machines,
a candidate.
Yeah,
Okay.
or a number of candidates actually. And I think Doris actually brought that up, and she brought it to the Attorney General. Because it's basically using your tax dollars against your will, or against the interest of the people, but rather for a select few.
Yeah, I would think that, particularly in an educational institution where you want to have debate on both sides of an issue and encourage people to think for themselves, that you shouldn't be taking a partisan stance on one side or the other.
Yeah, basically something to the effect that you vote for these people because these people are scary.
Yeah.
And that's something that has to be addressed because it's using public property to do that. And I know the mayor's aware of it. I know that the head of the school district is aware of it. A lot of people are aware of it. The Attorney General. Let's see where it goes.
That brings us up into our next topic, Kevin, which is charter schools and some of the advocates opposing charter schools. There's a very interesting article in yesterday's Wall Street Journal called The Big Lie About Charter Schools. They talk about some of the arguments that are made opposing charter schools by certain organizations, particularly the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, and how what it reports here is that in the last presidential election, those two unions spent $64 million on lobbying. $64 million.
And not on education.
And not on education.
Interesting.
It's not for training their teachers, not for advocating for school choice. It's to basically try to keep the status quo, which is your kids must be locked up in these schools, and we would fight to prevent those kids from going elsewhere.
Yeah, and I'm one of those parents that did some homeschooling years ago. And I remember taking my son to Sturbridge Village, and we were walking by one of the fences, and where a gentleman was shoveling. Michael turned to him and looked, and he says, "What are you shoveling?" And without a second, he said, "Bureaucracy." It was probably the best lesson my son could have ever heard. But bureaucracy. Well, these unions are fighting to keep the bureaucracy as status quo. And yet for that kid, that little girl, that little boy that's struggling in school, that can't read, that doesn't get it, and feels stupid because he doesn't get it, or she doesn't get it because she learns audibly. He's got dyslexia. He learns physically, or there's another way that they learn, and they don't fit into that cookie cutter system. And the parents don't have enough money to send that child to a private school that will meet that kid's needs. No, you got to go through the system. What happens? They tune out. And then they become a social problem. They get involved with drugs. We have an opioid crisis. It's not the whole reason for it, but I'm sure it contributes when people drop out of the system and they just sit back and they feel like they're stupid. Well, I'm going to play my video games or whatever.
Yeah, they disengage from the learning process.
I was one of those kids. And I could barely read by the time I was in 6th grade. And I really did feel stupid. And I think having experienced that My dad didn't have the money to send me to the private schools. Here is a program that doesn't fit the bureaucracy's modus operandi, MO.
Yeah.
So they're thinking outside the box. They've come with creative ideas on ways to educate kids, like the Micro Society here in Nashua, or the Science and Technology place right up the road here in Nashua. Some of the best in the country, and they're geared towards a specific type of learning that will match the kid. The education will match the kid's needs. And that's really what our whole education is for. We're not here to serve the bureaucracy or to save the bureaucracy or to build more administrators. That's not what we're here for. We're supposed to cherish in our Constitution the education, the outcome, as you said earlier, and also provide piety, which is another thing that the bureaucracies cannot do. And that is in your Constitution, and it's constantly overlooked. The education should match the child. And the elitism that is out there that says, well, no, we have to, the sanctimonious love of the bureaucracy, spending $64 million or whatever it is to protect the bureaucracy is crap.
In fact, we have an example of that very recently, Kevin.
Yes.
We had a federal grant coming our way for charter school expansion. And what happened? What did the bureaucracy do with this grant that was given to the city of Nashua?
Well, the people that say that they love education and they're all about the child, they tabled it, I believe, in finance. Is that correct?
Right. So in this particular case, I think you have great points in regards to the bureaucracy of school and the administration and how we do things, and contracts provide for a certain type of time of day and certain days and what we're going to do when. In this particular case, it was the legislative piece of the process that has put a monkey wrench into the delivery over the next few years to the state of $46 million for our charter schools. The amount immediately on the table was $10 million, and the reality is it's still laying on the table because the committee voted along party lines that they would not take up the request. Which was to approve this money coming into the state as requested by the Commissioner of Education. And it's a real shame because we talk about charter schools and people sort of think that there's something else, and charter schools are public schools.
That's exactly right.
They are public schools. And I think one of the reasons people get so excited about it in the bureaucracy of education is that if you decide to take your child from the city school and put them in one of the charter schools, and Nashua has great ones, the money that comes through your taxpayer money that ends up going back to the government, back through the state, back to your child in your school district, goes from your school district with your child to the charter school.
But not all the money.
Not all of the money.
The public school still gets the money for its operations.
But part of that money does go to charter schools. So this type of other money that we're talking about would then supplement that money that the charter schools. And the charter schools can do more with less because they're doing innovation, they're doing different things, but they're still a school under state law. So it really is a shame that the fiscal committee decided that they weren't going to address it, because that issue of the money is the same for the kids in your neighborhood who go to private schools. Yeah. You don't hear the bureaucracy saying we should shut down private schools because they're there and we know it. And the same thing happens if the head count is not there in the school, it doesn't matter what other building they're in. If they're not in the school, that money is not tracking.
Well, if a kid is going to private school and the parents are ponying up for that private school, the public school is still getting its money.
Right.
They are still getting their money. And it's the same way with the charter school. They're still getting a certain degree. But again, we're not here to serve the schools. The schools are there to serve the children and to educate them. And if the teachers would get wise to what's really going on with regards to, why aren't they getting paid more? I'll tell you why. It's because administration is out of hand. It has grown exponentially, not just in New Hampshire, but across the country. We're top heavy. We've got great teachers in New Hampshire. We have a great city, and they deserve raises. They deserve a good, to be compensated for what they do. They don't just stop at 2 or 3 o'clock.
Yeah, I
they're
think,
doing homework.
especially in today's day and age. I was a kid. We had stay-at-home moms. I walked home from lunch for lunch and walked back to school in the afternoon. But now you've got a case where you got working parents.
Yep.
You've got what we used to call broken homes, families who have split up, and you have a single parent trying to take care of the kid. So that puts an additional burden on the teacher now, because besides being the instructor of the student, there's also a role model that teacher is serving, mainly for a missing parent. So I think they actually have a harder job these days, given the
There's a host
breakdown
of
of our
issues.
family.
There's food insecurity, the drugs, peer pressure, bullying. There's a host of things that.
Well,
that
I'd
these
also like to
teachers-
point out, I think that's true, but you raised an interesting point. Besides the fact that you had to walk to school through 10 feet of snow, uphill and downhill both ways on your way to get there, I'm sure. You raised the point that you walked home for lunch.
Yeah.
Kids today have 20 minutes for lunch. If you look at a school schedule, that's what I just went and saw a child in a middle school this past week, and there was a 20-minute block for lunch. And so the other thing that's happening is there is no time for kids to walk home for lunch, even if it was possible, and back, because not only are there issues from a social standpoint and getting along, but the reality is if you look at what we now require schools to teach our kids, which are not what many of us learned in school, you'd realize that we're also forcing a lot more things into the bucket of learning for our kids that may or may not be there. And some other things are getting forced out in the picture because we've got so many things that we're trying to teach in the schools.
Yeah, going back to my education back in the 50s and early 60s, it was the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Right.
You were pounded drills. You had to learn penmanship, cursive writing. These were all useful skills that a young adult could find useful in surviving. Also, there's a number of social skills that you learn because we didn't have the cell phones or the TVs to play with. You had to
communicate
with your peers.
One-on-one.
And you're not going to like everybody, but you can find a way to get along.
Right.
And, you have to be careful about bullying, but I think the risk today with the social media is that instead of having a face-to-face discussion about a thing you're concerned about or maybe a dispute, now you can go and type some nasty stuff and hide.
Yeah.
That's really...
I think it's going to take its toll. I
take
really
its
do.
toll, I think.
But getting back to the charter schools, people like Micro Society here, right up here on West Hollis Street.
Yeah.
They teach you these social skills in communicating, banking. A whole, you're in a little city and you have to run it, and you're learning as that goes on, and that's that's a beautiful thing, and it's working for some kids. And so, there was some money that should have gone to them. It's being held back. I think the only ones that are getting hurt are the kids. That's the bottom line to this. And I kind of take it personally. I get a lump in my throat because I know that there are kids nationwide that are being pulled out of poverty, that are getting that extra boost. We're hearing from the Democrats on the national scale. We care. We care. We're going to take from the rich, and because they're too rich, and we're going to distribute it out. Well, here's a bunch of people that have high and mighty on themselves, and yet when these kids have an opportunity to go to a private school or a charter school like their kids are going to, that they're able to pay for, they're all multimillionaires. They're saying no.
Well, and we know we have more families with children that want the opportunity because these schools are running lotteries for the children to get in them. And there are some very happy children and families when those lotteries are completed, and some very sad children and families when those lotteries are over because their child wasn't selected. And as to the fiscal committee's action, they've sort of parlayed it into further consideration, and they claim that they had a lot of questions that they needed answers on. And supposedly there is information that's going to be sent to the committee. And it's my understanding that the fiscal committee will actually be taking this up again on December 13th. So for you, when you're talking to your neighbors or your friends, if they think it's something important, have them call the Senate in Concord and have them call the House in Concord, whether it's the Democrat or the Republican office, and say, I am a resident of this state. This vote affects the entire state. I want the representative on the fiscal committee to vote to take this matter off the table. And I want this representative or senator to vote to accept this grant money so that more children in this state can have the opportunity that they want and is good for them. So December 13th, it's my understanding there's another shot at this. And the more people who get out there and make those phone calls and make their voices be heard, it is good. And I will say email is... I personally don't think email is a great way to contact your legislature. And I know there are many advocacy groups out there, and you do a great job of getting together and contacting legislators with emails. But we get emails not only from constituents, but from Washington, from other states. It's really sort of appalling, frankly.
I think letters work.
Letters work and phone calls, because if you have staff that is answering the phone all the time, and you say you want your name said and communicated, they'll do that. And that will be much more effective to have a senator come into their office. House reps don't have an office, but we have a minority office and a majority office that take the calls. So if their staff saying they're getting a lot of calls on this, that will resonate with the people who are sitting in that committee on the 13th in regards to this money.
On the phone numbers, those phone numbers are available on the House.
I apologize for not
Senate
having them
websites.
right now on the tip of my tongue in regards to being able to give them, but as much as, if you just Google Concord, New Hampshire, majority office, minority office, you'll get a lot of information.
A typical example of what you just said, there'll be a particular issue and we'll get a host of maybe 100, maybe 200, maybe even up to 500 emails. And they're all saying the same thing. And on occasion, I've seen blocks of them, and I would answer a few of them, and some people would come back and say, well, I didn't know that this was an issue. They had no clue. And after a while, when you see that over and over, that response like, oh, thank you for calling me, but I don't think I sent that. Your name was pulled up from something and put into a slot. So it's hard for us to determine what is true and what isn't if they're all the same. So making the phone call makes a difference. And we will listen when we're up there.
I think all the senators have an individual office number. don't
Yes, they do.
And we have staff.
Yeah.
But one final thing on the charter school, if I can just say, that they're educating these kids at a fraction of the cost of the traditional public schools. They're doing it at a fraction. And here's another way that maybe we can save some money, by encouraging growth of more and more charter schools. Might be a way, the taxpayers have had it.
Yeah, on that topic, Kevin, we had an interesting piece of information that came through on the new tax rate in the city of Nashua. It was reported in the local paper. It says, state says city's tax rate, 2.6% increase for homeowners. Now, our good friend Kevin Scully, former state rep, did a little research on that and said, well, that's only for the half of the year. The real rate is twice that, or 5.2%.
But that's where the media needs to get its act together and give the whole information to the people. This is why they become the bane of our existence, because they're not telling you the whole story. Where's Paul Harvey when you need him?
Well, I think it's Bill O'Reilly right now who's doing a Paul Harvey-like message of the day in the mornings on most radio stations. But again, this is, as you point out, this isn't complete. We saw the first article about the Hanover city clerk not giving the whole truth about the impact of registering to vote. And now we have another article in the paper not giving the whole truth about the increase. Well, it's 2.6% for 6 months. Well, why don't you just say it's only half the rate that the taxpayer is going to be paying? Because you're going to be paying your taxes twice a year. You're going to be paying 1 year's worth of taxes. And that's 5.2% beyond what it is today.
My next door neighbors, their house was reassessed $500,000. They can't sell their house for $500,000.
Yeah. I mean, you like to tell the assessor, look, if you think it's worth that, I'll sell it to you.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
maybe
make-
5% off.
You
even.
can make, I'll give you 5%. You can make a buck off this,
Yeah. Hey, money for your town.
Yeah, that's right. And you can see the lump in their throat as they're talking about, I can't afford this. I can't afford to sell it. You know, and now we're getting a proposal of 120. It started off 80 million. Now it's 120 million. Somebody says it might be 135 million with the new school projects that are going on.
Yeah.
And the kids, the inner city kids that used to walk to Elm Street will have to be bused. That is an increase of exponential increase. It's not just the building. Now you've got to bus these kids instead of letting them walk to school. If you can renovate,
And what's healthier, Kevin, walking to school or taking a bus?
it all depends on the time of year, right?
Well, a little side story. I went to public schools in the city of Chicago, the inner city, and the deal was the school never closed. It never closed. Your job as a kid was to get to school. Maybe you got to get up a little earlier. Maybe you got to take a bus instead of taking your bike. Maybe you got to walk through some snow, but the school opened 8 o'clock in the morning.
Oh,
And
wow.
it's your job to be there.
Is it still that policy now?
I don't know. Probably not.
Probably not.
They probably got a little softer on the physical education.
Yeah. So
I mean, our physical education was kind of dodgeball in the schoolyard, you know, part of our social interactions to kind of bonding with our fellow classmates.
we had recess and all that kind of
Whack
stuff.
them on the head with a ball once in a while to show them that you like them. Right.
I think again the taxes. If they're only telling half the story, that's very political.
Yeah.
That's not information. That's political because they're leaving out the important stuff. There are people on fixed incomes that this is hurting.
Any final thoughts, Barbara?
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, sorry for being so heavy.
Thanks. And on that note, I'll say happy Thanksgiving to all of our viewers. It's a pleasure being able to have panels like this with great guests, and look forward to the next session of The People's View with you. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.